mask on. Hi, everyone. Glad you're here. We're going to go on an exploration of our Torah Scrolls. I don't know whether we've ever done this before, so it's exciting to take a look at some of the really cool oddities that exist within our Torahs. And we can also get an appreciation for the artistry of what it takes to create and maintain these Torah Scrolls, that the Sofers are really just do some incredible, incredible work. So we've got 7 of our regularly used Torah Scrolls that are out here. Our 8th is the Torah Scroll that comes from Prague, and that one that is actually doesn't belong to us. It's one that we hold. But that one is actually a really special one. It's a Kabbalistic Torah Scroll, actually. And there are some really interesting things about that one, too, and maybe we can take a look at that another time. In Florida, I remember seeing a Torah Scroll that was a Kabbalistic Torah Scroll as well. And what was really interesting about it is that the letter Fe, do you all know the letter Fe? It's sort of like a curl, it's sort of a coil. Those ones, they coil and they coil. They look like actually like a black hole in a sense. They coil and coil and coil. They circle in. And I was asking the Sofer about it, the scribe, when he came to Florida, and he said, well, it's really interesting. This is a Kabbalistic scroll. Unfortunately, everybody who understands why these Fe's are like this have passed away, particularly because of the Holocaust. And because scribes, they don't understand the tradition, because everyone who passed away and all of the works were destroyed explaining it, they can't create new ones that are like it. So when they copy a Torah scroll, they can't actually copy it without understanding why it exists. So those are basically very precious and they're unique, and the one that is in the other room is one of those as well. But it gives you a sense of really how seriously the artistry is taken of copying from one Torah scroll to the next. And these Torah scrolls are copied one from another faithfully, and it goes all the way back, so that when we uncovered the fragments in Qumran, which are from roughly around the 2nd century BCE into the 1st century, we found that there was extraordinary harmony with the text. They've done such a good job of maintaining and copying from one Torah to the next. And so over those millennia, there have been different ways of doing things, and different textual traditions that have been passed from generation to generation. We're going to see some of them. Yeah.
So, with the Kabbalistic Torah, is there something that's obviously different about it?
Yeah. So some of the lettering is different, but certainly those Fe's, the letter Fe that goes like, and usually it would just sort of go in a circle or like sort of almost squarish in the text itself. But this one, it just spirals. It creates a spiral that spirals right into the middle. And you can guess as to why. I don't know. I mean, the truth is we don't know, right, why that is. And that's why they can't copy them anymore. And the Prague one is one of those. It's a Kabbalistic Torah scroll. So we're going to start actually with looking at our Torah scrolls and some of the beautiful scribal traditions. Rabbi Pozlowski is going to talk about it. But first, I just want to share with you that this is the Gordon Torah. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the Torah Scrolls as we know about them. And this is the one that we use for every B'nai Mitzvah service. And the story of this Torah Scroll is that there was a community that would gather, and they particularly loved this Torah Scroll. It's beautiful. It's a really great Torah Scroll. In fact, I've got some information about it I can share with you. That this Torah Scroll, or maybe Rabbi Pozlowski, I sent that to you. You can maybe share that also. But the story of the Torah Scroll is not there. This Torah Scroll comes from Poland, and it's actually probably about 120 years old, 130 years old. And this Torah Scroll was much loved by the community that would come together. And when the Nazis amassed upon the Polish border, where there was one gentleman that was part of that congregation that hid the Torah Scroll away. And sure enough, when the Nazis entered into Poland, initiating the Second World War, they came and they liquidated all of the communities. And the man that hid the Torah Scroll was taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where life expectancy was at most a week, 2 weeks. He managed to survive there until the end of the hostilities when the camp was liberated. And after the camp was liberated, he returned to where he had hidden the Torah Scroll away in that town, and brought it to a surviving remnant of what was once this extraordinarily vibrant Jewish community in Poland. I mean, we're talking, Warsaw was like New York City, with the Yiddish theater and poetry and everything was probably even more vibrant and larger than New York City at that time. And there was a tiny remnant that remained there. And they continued to use this Torah scroll until that community became so small that they decided to send their Torah scrolls away, as the people started to move to places like the United States and Canada and Israel. And so they sent this Torah scroll to the United States, and that's when Congregation Shalom heard about it and brought it here. And this Torah scroll is very small and light, and so it's perfect for B'nai Mitzvah students. And so every B'nai Mitzvah student uses it, and it's actually, the text is really beautiful in this. So, Rabbi Pozlowski, you want to talk about our first stop on the tour? And you guys, you can come and actually, if you feel comfortable, come take a look at what we're talking about.
Yeah. So just a little bit about it. So we're going to look at the first sort of textual variant in here. Oh, thanks.
The Gordon family are the ones who sponsored bringing it here. They paid for it. Yeah. The Gordons, yeah. That's right.
I guess I should come over to this side. So just to give you a little bit of context for this verse, so we're at the point here in Genesis 34. This is the point where Jacob has left his uncle Laban's, and he's setting out to find a new home. And along the way, he has to go through Edom. He has to pass through the land where Esau is. And he's nervous because the last time they saw each other was when he stole his birthright. So you can imagine the anxiety there. And at this point, they're grown. Jacob has amassed his own wealth, and so has Esau. And Jacob lets Esau know that he's going to be passing through, and Esau decides to meet him with 400 men. So Jacob is understandably a little bit nervous. So the two of them, we're here. So the two of them meet in person, and the verse is, here, I'm going to actually come around here for a second. Sorry. Yeah. They didn't cover that at HUC. So the verse here starts by Yar. So that's that. So here's the actual word. But it starts, Vayaratz Esav likrato vayechab kehu vayipol al tzavarav vayisha kehu. So this is the word that we're going to be looking at right here. And if you come closer to it in a second, you can see these little dots above each letter.
See those, Stevie?
Yeah.
You see the little dots?
Sure.
Just a
Yeah.
quick aside, in Yemen, they didn't have many books, the Yemeni Jews. And so there are Jews who learned, because they only had a few books to share, there are Jews that learned how to read Hebrew sideways and upside down. And so when I went to Opan, the first time when I was in Israel before rabbinical school, one of my teachers is Yemeni, he used to pick up a newspaper and used to read it on its side. Because that's where he sat in his version of Cheder in Yemen before he moved to Israel.
That's amazing.
Sounds like a story.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Silversmiths. The silversmiths in Yemen were extraordinary. Never knew that.
Yeah. So, yes,
Fourth line down, you can
right
see
here.
those little dots on the last word.
Vayisha kehu. So you can see these little dots at the top. So it sounds like it couldn't have gone any better. So the verse in English is Esau ran to greet him, he embraced him, and falling on his neck, he kissed him, and they wept. So he's nervous. The two brothers meet after all this time, and it sounds amazing. But, yes.
That's a problematic verse, isn't it?
So we can see the word is different than most of the other words in the Torah because it has those dots. And the Masoretes explain that the dots tell us something. It's something to call our attention to the words. And they've given several different explanations for why it's dotted. So in Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is between 650 and 950 CE, so it's in Talmudic era in Israel and Babylon. It says there are 10 words in the Torah that have these dots, and this example, the term for Vayishakehu has dots above every letter to teach that Esau did not kiss Jacob sincerely. Okay? So it says this in the Torah, but the dots are saying, well, maybe not so sincere. And but then Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, no, it means that this one was sincere, but all of the rest of the times that he kissed him were not sincere. So then we have Rabbeinu Bachya, who's 13th, 14th century Spain, and he likes a Kabbalistic style like Nachmanides, and he agrees with the first interpretation that it's not wholehearted, and he adds that it started in anger, which makes sense. And he backs it up with a couple of proof texts from other parts in Tanakh. In Proverbs 27:6, it says, the kisses of an enemy are profuse. So kind of like flattery will, keep your enemies close, I guess. And then uses a text from Amos 1:11, because his anger raged unavailing and his fury stormed forever. So that's that section. And then in Bereshit Rabbah, which is a commentary and midrash on Genesis, it says that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar teaches about Esau's compassion, and then Rabbi Yanai disagrees with him. He says not only was it not his intent to kiss him, but he was trying to bite him.
Bite him. Maybe those dots were indicative of teeth.
Maybe teeth marks. Yeah, that's a good explanation. So they say that Jacob's neck became like marble, and that Esau's teeth were blunted. They became like wax. And they wept is the last word in the verse. Jacob's weeping because his neck is now stone, and Esau's weeping because his teeth are now wax.
What imagination.
Yes.
Don't you think that Esau gets a raw deal in this? I mean, I think that I think they really do.
The old saying, two Jews, three opinions, holds even more true for our lives.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the best part, right?
2 Jews and 100 different opinions. Yeah, it's really, and then, so Radak comes in and says, not only, so he says, when there are more dots than letters, we give emphasis to the interpretation more so than what the words actually say. If there are less dots than the number of letters, we say it is as it means in the plain text. And this one, there's a dot over each of the actual letters. So here we go. So each letter, and that's a vowel, so that's why there's not one over that. And he says, since they're equal, we should understand it the way the text is written. And Rabbi Yanai says, well, then why bother to put the dots there? If it just means what it says, why are we emphasizing this, right? And so he says we have to interpret it that Esau originally did intend to bite Yaakov's neck, and that God made his teeth soft like wax and Yaakov's neck like marble or ivory, okay? And Rashi, one of the famous medieval commentators on Talmud and Bible, he says that, no, it actually was sincere. Some of the sages say it wasn't, but Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, we know that Esau hated Jacob, but in this particular moment, he has pity on him. and so it is sincere. And that's sort of, we have a bunch of different opinions. So some of the rabbis say it is sincere, and some say it's not. Some say it was, this beautiful moment between two brothers that haven't seen each other in a really long time and had this awful rift over the birthright. And some people say, no, it wasn't such a beautiful moment. It was actually a lot of anger and resentment that got thwarted. So that's our textual variant for that one. Yes. Yeah. It does.
Exactly. So what's the difference between this script and other scripts? So
So this one's Beit Yosef script. It's very clear. And so getting back to, so Rabbi Kozlowski mentioned the Masoretes. So they were a group that were around from around the year 500 to 1,000. And what they saw their job, they were actually engaged in an extraordinary salvage operation. They lived in Tiberias, they lived in Jerusalem, they lived in modern-day around what modern-day Baghdad is. And after the destruction of the temple, and as Jews spread out all across southern Europe along the Roman trade routes, Hebrew as a language wasn't quite spoken anymore, just like as it was before. And when a language isn't spoken, then you need to do something to preserve it, right? So hold on one second. I want to make sure that. So I'll let Linda ask her question, then I'll finish. So no worries. So they were spread out all along the Roman trade routes. They needed to preserve the language. And when you speak a language, you don't really need things like vowels, for example. Like if you were to watch Wheel of Fortune, right? And you've got a sentence, and they punish you by asking you to buy a vowel, right? Because you shouldn't need it. Like if I were to give you a sentence like that starts with the first word TH blank, and then the next word is C blank T, and then the next one was blank N. And the next word was, do you know what I'm saying? The cat in the hat. We know this because we speak the language. But if you're not speaking a language, not having vowels is really problematic. So the Masoretes were the ones that formalized the system of vowels, that when you pick up a siddur and you see the vowels around the letters, because you see there's no vowels in this text, they were the ones that formalized that. They're also the ones that formalized the musical system. When you hear people chant Torah, the reason why we chant Torah is to preserve the language as it sounded. So when we speak to each other, for example, we're singing. We are singing our language. If we weren't singing our language, we would sound like robots, like Siri. Like how Siri sounds, like she doesn't really know what she's saying. The reason is because she's not singing the language like we do. So they preserved it through musical notation called trope. And that also guarantees that you put the right emphasis on the right syllable. And the reason why that's so important is that when Israel was founded, in 1948, they had a language that they could speak that was preserved ritually over thousands of years, even though it was no longer a spoken language. They could resume, using this language so beautifully because they preserved it. The Masoretes also formalized where the columns would be, where the paragraph breaks would be. I don't believe they were the ones that did the crowns, that you see there's a system of crowns on some letters. But different rabbis had different preference for different Masoretic schools. So there are different, and so Maimonides, for example, who is like, the mega brain, he had his favorite Masoretic school. And so he wrote a book on what it means to be a sofer and how to do this, how to space it out, how to make a Torah scroll, where the paragraph breaks are, where the columns are, how long it should be, how big the letters are, which letters should be big, which letters should be small. And Maimonides followed a particular school. Then it divided into further divisions, like there's a Hasidic textual tradition, there's an Ashkenazi textual tradition, there's a Sephardic textual tradition, and there's also a Chabad textual tradition. And generally, everybody says that these are okay. Like if like a Sofer who was schooled in Ashkenazi tradition would look at a Sephardic text, they'd be like, that's fine. They agree with differences. But the only thing that isn't fine is if they can't explain it, if they don't understand. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
So the difference in the text columns,
Mm-hmm.
these are totally
Yep.
straight through.
Yeah.
These have
Spaces. That's
Are
right.
these like paragraphs or the start of a new
That's right. That's right. These are different paragraphs, and sometimes you'll see that if you pick up a chumash, and if you look, you'll see a little mark, a samech, usually marks where the paragraph breaks are. Actually, Brian, do you have it?
Yeah, I've
Awesome.
a different spot, but,
Okay.
so,
Yeah.
some here, some here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that letter that'll come up here and there, in the scroll itself, you'll have the little break.
And yeah, exactly. And then those are defined by schools. Well, it's definitely separating a thought. Yeah, you're right. And so, by the way, the Masoretes, what they did was really important. And I often say this to Christian groups who are coming in, that when you pick up a book with a translation, like that is, this is actually making me laugh that we're still in the first Torah and we have 7 to go. but when we read the Hebrew, it's really important that we understand the Hebrew. We're an interpretive tradition. We can interpret things all different ways. If I asked a Christian, how does the Bible begin? They'll say, in the beginning, right? The truth is that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says Breshit. And frankly, in the beginning would be Ba-Reshit. But we read it Be-Reshit. It's a different vowel that the Masoretes put in Be. In a beginning. Or when God began to create. In a beginning. And that's a vowel that's not even in the Torah, right? So the thing is that it's highly interpretive. And if I ask questions, so what's the difference between in a beginning and in the beginning? And it's like the entire way we understand our reality is different based on a difference of opinion about a vowel that's not even in the Torah. I mean, that's a big deal. So the Masoretes did something really extraordinary. And even the way we read it is a commentary on the text itself. Between 500 and 1,000. So around 500, CE, Common Era. Yeah, before that, there's all kinds of variations on our Torah scrolls. You can find it, like many of them, in the Cairo Geniza. But they, generally, they're remarkably, like the spacing won't be the same, but all the letters go in the same order. There's some variation that you'll find, but it's really coherent and has kept its soundness through thousands of years. Particularly, you can tell from the Qumran fragments, which are really the oldest that we have. Should we move to the next one? So this one is a neighbor to Poland. So this one is from Russia. This Torah is from Russia. Let's just you can put it back down because I got it. Made it easy for us. And this one is one of my favorites, this textual tradition, because there's all kinds of reasons why it may be this way. Yep. So this is the beginning of Leviticus, which we call Vayikra. Okay? And so if you look, also, by the way, Torah portions or books come from the portions or delineated by the first distinguishable word. Vayikra is really easy because it's the first word, but sometimes it's like, sometimes it'll be, sometimes there's like a whole sentence where it's like very common, like God spoke to Moses, right? And so that's really common, so that wouldn't be a good one. So you have to find the first word, except this one we're lucky, Vayikra. Now take a look. Do you guys notice anything about Vayikra, the word Vayikra? The aleph, right? The aleph is tiny. It's small. So let's talk about why Vayikra might be, why it might be small. So one of the theories about why Vayikra, the aleph, is small is that, look at the word next to it. Vayikra El Moshe. It is entirely possible that at some point there was a sofer that left out an aleph by accident. And so the sofer did this might be thousands of years ago, 1,500 years ago, 1,600 years ago, 1,700 years ago, and this sofer probably did what a lot of us do if we leave a letter out, What do we do if we leave a letter? You write it in small, you squeeze it in. And so the next person that copied this text probably did the same thing, thinking that there's meaning, and there is meaning, right? So, Vayikra el Moshe, God called to Moses, right? Vayikra is like God called, right? And so the rabbis have all kinds of explanations. I'm going to give you a couple. So this one from Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. He says, in the letters of the Torah, which God gave at Sinai, there are 3 sizes: intermediate letters, oversized letters, and miniature letters. As a rule, the Torah is written with intermediate letters, signifying that a person should strive for the level of the intermediate person. Adam's name is spelled with an oversized aleph in Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1, because his self-awareness led to his downfall. On the other hand, Moses, through his sense of insufficiency is the word he used, but I like to say humility, attained the highest level of humility, expressed by the miniature aleph of Vayikra, right? And I think it's not, I mean, this is common when we're thinking about leaders, right? In our world, that we want leaders to also be listeners. But I think it speaks a lot about prayer, right? That in order for us to hear the call of God, sometimes we need, aleph is a silent letter. There's no actual sound, aleph doesn't create a sound. It takes on the sound of whatever vowel is there. So we need to find a sense of stillness as well in order to receive, whatever messages we wish to receive throughout our lives or from God. And so having a small aleph, you can create some extraordinary commentary from it. There's also from Baruch Siena, who's a teacher out in Toronto, says, because the aleph is also silent, it's considered a symbol of modesty. There is a wonderful story in the Zohar that has all the letters arguing over which one should be chosen to start the Torah, going backwards from Taf. Each letter makes a case, and the fighting is ended when God picks the bait for Breshit. But the aleph, of course, being silent, hasn't been heard from. And because going backwards, the aleph comes after the bait, God rewards it for its modesty, and the aleph is chosen to start the 10 Commandments. Ani, right? Ani. Anochi, or rather, Anochi Adonai Elecha. Right? Yes, they did. All right, so you can see this is the beginning of the book of Vayikra, and that's why there's this large space in between. That marks the beginning of a new book. So sometimes, when we're scrolling through as rabbis trying to find a Torah portion, it's a lot, we find the beginning of the book, and then it's a lot easier to find it from there. So this was probably sealed. There was probably a tear. And this is special stuff that they put down in order the sofer does to repair the text itself. There are a lot of repairs. It's kosher. There's a lot of, this Torah is right now not kosher. But it's not kosher because it's aged, and there are places in which the letters are not fully, some of them are broken. There's also a tear in one place in it, and so that there are some reasons why this isn't kosher. Not because of anything with Oh, that tape is all over here, and that's used to double bind. It's still organic, and what's used to sew these pages together is also organic. A sofer will use a feather. Usually, there's debate over whether it needs to be a kosher bird. Usually they're using turkey feathers these days, and a very specific type of ink that is outlined by Maimonides. And they have to use this particular type of ink, dip it with a feather. They write every word for God. They can't make any mistakes. If they make a mistake on the word for God, then they have to start from the beginning. Not of the Torah, of this piece. And then if they write a mistake and it's beyond repair, they can throw out the text unless it's the name of God. And if the name of God is in it, then they put it away. And that's what they did in the Geniza in Cairo, and why because they were treated with that sense of reverence, even though they were mistakes or they were old or they weren't in use anymore, it means that archaeologists or sociologists can look back and they can look at these texts and see how stable the texts have been over the centuries. Let's move on to the next one. Brian, he's got a really cool one.
All right, so I'm going to take this off and then pick up the microphone just so we can see what we're looking at. All right, so here we are in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. Thank you. So this is our fourth out of the 5 books in the Torah, and we have this really interesting section. I know, they don't stay open. Where we have these 2 nuns. They're actually backwards nuns. They're not part of any words. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only place where there are extra letters in the scroll, where there's something that we don't read, that it's not part of any other word. So in this part of the Torah, we are at the moment of leaving Mount Sinai. So from the time the Israelites arrived in the book of Exodus, through the rest of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first 10 chapters of Numbers, we've been at Sinai, and this is the moment where they've just left. And so these 2 verses, they translate to, and it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord, and let thy enemies be scattered, and let them that hate you flee before you." And when it rested, he said, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000s of the families of Israel." So a little bit 2 interesting verses. We wonder why they're set apart. And, the rabbis asked about this a lot, in the Talmud and Rashi and all of the rabbis of old. And the main conclusion that they came to is that these 2 verses are out of place, that this is not where they go, and that's why we have these 2 nuns to demarcate them, to show that these shouldn't be here. And then, of course, the question is, why were they put here, and where should they be? So, as for where they should be, a lot of the rabbis agree that they should actually be in chapter 2 of Numbers, about 8 chapters earlier, because this talks about that when they go out, when they start marching, and in that place, it's after chapter 2, verse 17, that is talking about when the Israelites go marching. So it would make sense to put these verses about marching in that spot in Numbers. However, they're put here, and the rabbis decided, as they thought about it, they suggested that they're put here to separate between 2 punishments that were brought down on the Israelites. And instead of having back-to-back punishments, then instead it makes sense to break that up with something a little more positive, so there wasn't all of this negative in a row. So right before it, it's not, it seems, I don't know, I struggle with the idea of it being a punishment, but immediately before it is when the Israelites turn away from Mount Sinai and start wandering the desert. And so the punishment is that they're no longer in this place at Sinai where they received the commandments, where they were a little more literally with God, even though God went with them, but they went away from that holy place. And immediately following this, the next verses are the Israelites complaining about food and about manna and doing what they did a lot of the time through the desert, complaining to Moses about everything that was happening. So these 2 verses get put in the middle to break up those 2 punishments, those 2 negatives. A few other quirks about these verses. They're 85 letters long in this spot, and from there, the rabbis in the Talmud took the tradition that any holy text of at least 85 letters needs to be saved if there's a fire or some kind of calamity. If it's 85 letters, you need to save it. If it's less than 85 letters, there's not enough there, that you don't necessarily have to go back and get it. So those short snippets, if they're shorter than these 2 verses, then you don't need to risk as much to go save them. And Yehuda Hanasi, one of the rabbis of the Mishnah, also posed the idea that maybe these 2 verses represent their own book of the Torah, and that there's actually 7 books of the Torah. There's the 5 we know, but then there's 3 in the book of Numbers. Everything before these verses, these 2 verses, and everything after. And he brings a verse from Proverbs that says, "With wisdom she built her house, she carved its 7 pillars." And so wisdom is generally credited as being part of the creation of the Torah. I wonder if you're going to talk about that later with Bereshit and wisdom. I don't want to know. So wisdom is also called the first, Reshit. And so Bereshit is also sometimes believed to be with wisdom the world was created. And here it also says, with wisdom she built her house, the 7 pillars. So might be like 7 days, or it might be like 7 books, and that's why this has to be its own book. So we get to 7. Or yes. Okay. It could be. Yes. So that it's just this little segment that, there's a lot of things that it could mean, but these two backwards nuns, are not found anywhere else in the Torah. We talked before in the Chumash where there's those little samechs that show where there's a break if you're looking at the scroll, but here within the scroll itself, it's the only place that demarcates something as different or other. That's... Yes, yeah. Yes, and it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let them that hate you flee before you." And when it rested, he said, "Return, O Lord, unto the 10,000s of the families of Israel."
So before we get to our next one, I'm going to read you a story from the Torah. It comes from Numbers chapter 25, beginning of verse 1. We studied this actually just recently in Torah study. So while Israel was staying at Shittim, the people profaned themselves by laying with the Moabite women, who invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. The people partook of them and worshipped that God. Thus Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, and Adonai was incensed with Israel. Adonai said to Moses, "Take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before Adonai, so that Adonai's wrath may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's officials, "Each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor." Just then one of the Israelites, an unfortunate Israelite, came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking the spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say, therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites." Because it says, "Grant him my pact of peace," is really what it should say, pact of peace. So I cannot find a rabbinic interpretation that criticizes Pinchas and his behavior at all. In fact, because God actually bestows peace on Pinchas, this pact of friendship and peace on Pinchas. And this is a terrible text, and those of you who studied every year, I'm like, I can't, fathom this. This is very upsetting. There's no commentary that says this was a problem, except one. Except one. And so let's take a look. So if Pinchas if you would move to the next slide, there you go. If Pinchas was given the pact of peace, right, for where might we find that there is some form of criticism? I'm going to need to come around to the other side of this, because this one is hard to find.
Is this a kosher one?
That I don't quite recall. Hold on. I don't think it is. Let me see. There it is. It's right here. So here is the covenant of peace. Now take a close look at Shalom. What do you see about it? Look at this Vav.
That little thing on top of the L?
Well, look at the Lamed. So Shin, Lamed, Vav, Mem, Sofit. But look at the Vav. Look very closely. It's broken. Right? And so this would typically render that letter unkosher, except in this one spot where the vav is broken. So we're almost signifying that, and this is the Sofer tradition, that there is some frustration that people have at the story, some anger. And this is the only place you're permitted to write a broken letter is on this broken statement of peace. And so it is a peace that is broken. And so Pinchas is given that brit of peace, but it's a broken one. Just about this Torah, it says up there, Sefer Torah is about 100 years old. Parchment is glazed, which makes it heavy, by the way, on the back in medium weight. It was written in a good Beit Yosef script, and this is from Lithuania, this one, this Torah scroll. All right, should we move to the next one? I think, Brian, you got the next one. If anybody didn't get to see, you can look really closely and you can find it. I took pictures of all of these earlier so that people at home could see.
Okay, so the next verse we're going to look at is a verse that I think we're all familiar with, something that we've all heard before. It's this verse right here. You can already see the bigger letters. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So a verse that we say every day in prayer, a verse that our youngest students at consecration last night were able to say. One of the first things we learn, that hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And as you can see, either up on the screen or here in the writing, the ayin and the daled are both enlarged. So around the time of the Talmud, there was another book in the Talmud called Sofrim, which didn't actually get included in the Talmud, but there were lots of things, and eventually they chose what was part of it and what was not. The book of Sofrim has all the different rules about how to write a Torah, like what letters should be bigger, which letters should be smaller, how things should be written. And it says a lot about Shema. The first thing it says is that Shema should take up an entire line, and it should be by itself on the line. There should be no other letters on there. And for a sentence, for a verse that is so important in our tradition, it makes sense that we single it out, that there's nothing else on that line, so it can stand alone. For the ayin, the reason the ayin is large is to make sure that we know the word is Shema, because an ayin, just like aleph, is a silent letter, and if we accidentally write aleph instead of ayin, and we get the word Shema, then we get the translation of perhaps Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And we don't want that to be a perhaps. We want to be very clear that it's listen. And then the daled is also important. The letter daled looks a lot like the letter resh. And if you confuse those letters and you get Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Acher, you get Adonai is our God, Adonai is other or different. So also very important that the ayin and daled are correct and not confused with commonly confused letters, which would greatly and in a negative way change the meaning of this verse. Finally, yes. Yeah, so this, just briefly right here, is the second reading of the Ten Commandments. So this is, you have lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov, that don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't be jealous. And so the Ten Commandments also, have a special way that they're written to mark them as special.
So a quick thing that's really cool about the second reading of the Ten Commandments is that in the first one, if you look up, we've got it up there, the fourth commandment, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, which means to remember the Sabbath day. And in the second one, there's a difference. It says Shamor, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, which means to guard. And that's why when we sing the verses like L'chadodi, Shamor v'Zachor, B'dibor Echad, right? We're saying both. And that's also why some people believe there are two candles that we light on Shabbat, to Shamor and Zachor, or Zachor v'Shamor, right?
So here's the Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. So here we have the word Shamor. And if we scrolled all the way back to Exodus...
Which we won't.
No, we won't. We'd find Zachor. So The other interesting thing, when you put ayin and daled together, they form the word aid, meaning witness. And there's a tradition that holds that every single one of us was at Sinai, and we were all a witness to God giving the Ten Commandments and giving the Torah. And so these letters remind us every time we see them that not only do we know those words, but we were there, and we witnessed it, and we were part of it. And it wasn't just our ancestors, but every Jew was there in that moment to be a witness to God giving those commandments.
Is it repeated again in the scroll? Is the Shema said again?
There are things that are like it.
But not,
Not-
where is this?
This is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4.
Is it vowel, written, and then the line extended? It
Yes.
looks like there is a little bit of a full vowel.
Yeah, the top line of the dalet extends to the end of the line.
Is it on that way on every Torah?
Every scroll, yes.
That one in particular, yes. But if you look, then you'll find that there are letters that are extended quite
Like
a bit throughout.
here you have lameds and reishes extended.
When they do that, it's sort of like when you justify your document to make sure that it goes square. It's the same idea. You justify it.
Yeah, so they're, right. So every line starts and ends in the same place, unless it stops earlier in the line. But Shema specifically, the ayin is large and the dalet extends like that. In other places, there might be other letters that extend, but these have to be written in this way.
It's always noticeable.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And interesting, it's one of there. You don't find every one, like you don't find the minimums in every single Torah scroll, but you find them in the Ashkenazi Torah scrolls. This one is a Sephardic Torah scroll, and this was made in Israel. This is actually the Katz Torah. This was donated in memory of Gary Katz, who passed away. And Rabbi Shapiro got this in Israel and brought this back, and it's a Sephardic Torah scroll. And this is consistent across, and this is like Sephardic text. You can sort of tell it's Sephardic text. It's a little bit different from the Ashkenazi way that you looked at the text or the letters, but it's consistent across the Ashkenazi and Sephardic level.
How do you keep them straight in those Torahs? By what they look like? Like, how do you know this?
After a certain amount of time, I know, particularly from the lettering, I can tell that this is a Sephardic text, which means I know it's the text. I also just
Because of the Quran.
Just wondering. There's ways. The next one,
So there's also, do those, yeah.
and there's also a numbering system that's on the bottom that we have the numbers and the numbers. Some of them less familiar with than others.
Looks like Islamic. If you back away, the writing.
Generally, the ones that are
So the languages come from the same place, so it makes sense.
Keep them all up to date? Are all of them round, wound to the correct spot? Just the ones you know you're
There's
using?
just one you read from.
Well,
No,
typically
you
for
don't.
Bar Mitzvah, there's one we read from, there's one we read from in the community service, that's kept up to date, and then there's other ones that we read generally like on holidays, and so those are usually in their position, but that's not good for them, they should be more.
Oh, yeah.
So I
You
exactly for you.
said last week you
Because I had rolled all of these, and by the way, I wanted to find something really particular that I knew was in one of the Torah scrolls, but I couldn't remember which one. So, and it was right at the beginning, so I had to roll every single one of these Torahs to the beginning.
No.
And then
Oh,
roll
and that's where they go. Oh, my goodness.
I did it by standing.
I have a picture of me at camp on a bed. Rolling. At the start of the summer, and we were so far off where we needed to be. All right, Rabbi Kozlowski.
Oh, this is so. This is the spot tour.
That
Yeah.
comes from the priestly blessing.
Yeah.
That comes back out of it. I'm wondering why.
I'm not sure.
But you can do it if you try. That with the blessing. Yeah. So they put it on the fancy. They fancy. Oh, Velcro. No. Oh, this is dedicated. No. Oh, I wonder if this is the one we wrote in?
I think so.
It is? Yeah, donate with congregation. This is probably the one we wrote in, 2003.
So this is the celebration.
Oh, that's the one.
Because you have to do that, that's one of the things you have to do.
It's the 612th mitzvah. That is 600, yeah.
Right there.
To write a Torah scroll. Yeah.
Wow.
Don't ask me what's the
So we're actually going to look at this scroll and this scroll because they have something together. So if you look at the very last letter of this scroll, the Lamed, it's larger. And that is, yeah, so the very last word is Yisrael, and the Lamed is larger. And then if you come over to this scroll, the Bet in Bereshit is also larger than the rest of the word. So if you put that together, Lamed and Bet, you get the word Lev, which means heart. So there's a tradition from Rabbi Nachman that it indicates that the Torah represents our heart. So this is the heart is the dwelling place of the spirit. So when we read on Simchat Torah, we read from the end and the beginning. So we're getting that Lev right there. And there's a tradition also that sometimes that you're supposed to read the end and the beginning in one breath so that you start the reading of Torah all over again without hesitating even a second.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we usually, since you guys haven't been here for consecration, we usually unwind the Torah, so it goes all the way to around there. And so I chant from the end of the Torah, Israel, and then I run to get Bereshit Bara. Yeah.
When do you say Hazak, but need Hazak?
Oh, after our Torah, after we finish.
You can't squeeze it in.
Can't squeeze it in. I go right from the Lamed to the Bet. Yeah, exactly.
There's one more really cool thing about it. So the word Lev, the gematria for that, the numerology, Lev is 32. And the name of God, Elohim, which you can see in this scroll right here, it's in the creation story 32 times. So it shows that when we attune our hearts to God, we can see God in every piece of creation, in all of creation.
How come those are?
Hold on. All right, good job. Yeshua, should we move to the next one? This Torah is a mystery to me. I know very little about this Torah scroll. In fact, I don't know whether even the Sofars who have come, they've never really assessed this Torah scroll, which is very strange. But if you look, I have searched high and low for an explanation for this, and I cannot find one, and I've never seen it before anywhere else. Breshit, and you can see it up there too. Oh, let's move to the next slide.
Things that talk about things being void. Those letters are void.
So these letters are hollow.
Yeah.
If you look, Breshit, Bara, except Elohim, each time is filled in, right? I've never seen a scroll outline like that. But what it's saying is when God began to create the heavens and the earth was unformed and void. Tohu vavohu, I like actually say mishmash, because it's the alliteration, tohu vavohu. It's like unformed and void. Tohu vavohu, mishmash, or wild and waste is another I like that it's, I like to preserve the alliteration of the tohu vavohu, but it's like wild and waste or mishmash. V'choshech al pnei tahom, and there was darkness over the face of the deep. V'ruach Elohim, and the Spirit of God, merachefet, which means hovered, al pnei hamayim, over the face of the waters. Vayomer Elohim, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, and God saw the light and it was good. And then, as soon as it says vayavdel, right, which is to distinguish, right, distinguishing between light and darkness. distinguish between, like lehavdil, like to distinguish, or havdalah, right? To distinguish between the end of Shabbat and the beginning of the week, it all goes solid black. Vayivdal Elohim bein ha'or, and God distinguished between the light, ubein ha'choshech, and between the darkness. Vayikra Elohim le'or yom, and God called the light day, u'lechoshech kara laila, and God called the darkness night. Vayihera, vayihivoker, yom echad, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. But you can see right when it says distinguish, it goes from light to dark. And it's so interesting because whoever the Sofer was, it's a commentary. The Sofer is making a commentary on this first day of creation. God is always filled in. Oh, God is always solid. Yep, never hollow. Yep. That's right. Everything else was, yeah. And so as soon as God distinguishes, it becomes, black and white, black letters on white background. And it's just fascinating to me. I searched high and low for an explanation. I cannot find one. But I just think it's so cool to see this one Torah scroll. I has never seen anything like it. So there's, first off, Maimonides wrote a lot of text on it. There is some early discussion. The Talmud has got a tractate on being a scribe. A lot of the rabbis later on also wrote, further commentaries on it. And truly, there's a halacha, a book for the sofers to use, which has a ton of explanation and tells them exactly things like, Linda, you asked about like the Ten Commandments and the spacing. Like they'll say, you need to leave like 32 spaces in between for letters in between, like here, and it really sets it out. And there's a template, exactly. So there is a lot of commentary and interpretation, and I can't find anything on this, nothing. But I think it's so cool. In the beginning, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was unformed and void, is how most people try. I like to say wild and waste, or wild and waste, or mishmash. I like the alliteration of tohu vavohu. That's right. It definitely has meaning. This was deliberate. First time I saw it, I thought somehow the letters had peeled. And I thought something's wrong. And then I noticed Elohim each time. Yeah, exactly. But the second I saw that, it was Elohim, 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 Elohim. I could see that it was not that it was just fading. But I don't know why. But I think, there's a lot of commentary that we can find from it just by looking at it. So there's this really cool tradition within our Torahs. We've just explored 7 of our Torah Scrolls in order to sort of find added meaning to our Torah. And we've just done an entire journey. So perhaps we should end before, we're going to say Kaddish because we're all here and we're not doing daily minyan. But perhaps we should end by saying, Chazak, Chazak, Venit Chazek. Be strong, and together let us be strengthened. All right. Any final thoughts? Rabbi, Brian? Thank you. We weren't sure I wasn't sure whether people would like it. I was like, I don't know, are people, I'm a total dork about this stuff, but I don't know. Are people gonna, yeah. So let's say Kaddish over, and if you want to grab a prayer book, you can, so that we can say Kaddish for those. Thank you, Linda, for closing that. So if you're picking up a Siddur, 294 is the page, and we'll find the Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. So what I said to the kids last night, I'll say it now too. We read the Torah according to a cycle, and there really is no end and there is no beginning. The fact that we hold that final word, Yisrael, Breshit, Bara, Elohim, there is no end to our Torah reading. Moves according to a cycle. And the Kaddish prayer is like that too.
right? The Kaddish, there's all kinds of Kaddishes that exist within our tradition that mark different periods, that mark we say Kaddish de Rabbanan when we move from one tractate to another. We say the Chatzi Kaddish when we move from one liturgical section of the Siddur to another. 294 is the page that we're on. And Kaddish, we recite when we think of loved ones who have passed away, because in every case, the Kaddish is never a period. It never denotes a sense of finality. There is always something that comes next. And so when we think about the cycle of our Torah reading, that we don't really have a beginning. We don't really have an end. And so it's the same with Kaddish too. 294. We are thinking of let's think of these members of our community who have passed during the period of Shiva. We think of Sue Salitra, whose funeral will be on Thursday. Yeah, Sue Salitra passed away over the weekend, and her funeral will be Thursday. We think of Dr. Wynne Stein-Snyder. We think of Karen Pearson. We add to those names those for whom we mark the Shloshim period. We think of Eileen Arbiter, Ed Asner, Stella Burton, Kevin Cox, Tony Lynn Fabric, Adrian Kachardimos, Joan Levine, Stephen Levy, Ruth Sherwin, Carrie Silberman, and David Wool. If there are names that should be added to this list of those who have passed away in recent days, or if you're commemorating the yahrzeit of a loved one, please say that name as I look in your direction. Our grief and sympathies are mingled as we turn to the sacred words of Kaddish Yatom on page 294, and even as we do, we also think of all those who died due to war and or terrorism, all those who died due to this terrible virus that has stricken our nation and our world. We think of those who have died due to the virus of xenophobia and racism. We think of all of those who have died due to, in defense of this nation and allied nations' ideals, as well as all those who perished during the Holocaust. Yitgadal v'yitkadash me rabba, v'yalma divrach rute v'yamlich malchute, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'yizman kari v'imru amen, yehe shmei rabba mevorach leolam ulame amaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, V'itadar, v'italev, v'italal, shmei de kudusha b'richu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'yimru amen, yehe shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen, oseh shalom b'imromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved. And let us say, Amen. Chag Sameach, everyone.